Standards flow from age to age, and everything evolves and changes, including human nature and the truth itself. If you were here and recall, I used as my example of that great historian, progressive historian's comment about the Declaration of Independence. To ask whether the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence is true or false is essentially a meaningless question. That's relativism. But the founders, it turns out, held those arguments to be self-evident. Self-evident, I would argue, in the way that Aquinas meant self-evidence when he wrote about it. What they understood to be self-evident is that all men are created equal, and so have equal rights, unalienable rights, endowed by their Creator and found in human nature itself. Which is to say, American constitutionalism makes no sense and has no legitimacy outside of the Declaration of Independence and its grounding in the rights of human nature. The title of our talk tonight comes from that same document, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. I note that that's not the Lockean formulation, which was life, liberty, and property, but happiness, an interesting choice of words. Jefferson picked, pointing to higher things by picking the classical word, happiness. One surely meant by that liberty which the Constitution says is a blessing. In particular, he meant a religious liberty. To understand the American idea of liberty in its most practical sense, in its highest sense, means we must study human nature. It brings us to our talk this evening. Because once again, Thomas Aquinas provides guidance, rich guidance, about the nature of rights and the nature of happiness. Father Thomas Joseph White is the director of the Thomistic Institute at the Dominican House of Studies here in Washington, D.C. We'll hear more about the Thomistic Institute at the end of our talk. He's originally a native of southeastern Georgia, and Father White studied at Brown University and then went on to Oxford University. He is the co-editor of the academic journal, Nova et Vetera, and an ordinary member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas. And his topic, to give its formal title, is Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, a 13th-century take on natural rights. Father White.
I'd like to thank Matthew for that warm and gracious introduction, and also for that excellent conceptual segue, because the way in which he introduced the theme of the talk is precisely the way I wanted to begin, which is by considering what Thomas Aquinas might say to another Thomas, that being Jefferson, regarding the intelligibility and meaningfulness of the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence. Now, I am not a constitutional scholar and don't know very much about the Lockean versus Montesquieuian origins of the founders' crafting of that important document, but it has a way of being that if you apply the light of Aquinas to most thinkers, it is in some way felicitous and helpful. So there's nothing wrong with bringing some of St. Thomas's thinking about nature and happiness to bear on Jefferson. So to start with the opening line of the Declaration of Independence that Matthew quoted, it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And again, as he noted, and I was going to say, he chose a term which is classical to Eudaimonean ethics. You find as thematic in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but also Augustine on the ethical life being a life of the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I really just want to hone in on a couple of ideas here. Jefferson, or the authors of the document, align the idea of human nature with happiness with the with the concept of what the fundamental aims of government and life in community are about. That the measure of the just actions of a government are inherently grounded in and related to the state's capacity to facilitate the human search for happiness. And that if that search for happiness is in some way undermined, that is something contrary to human nature, which acts as a guard, a rail guard against unjust and tyrannical government. So there is a strong sense, an Enlightenment philosophical sense, no doubt, of human nature as a certain kind of guide or measure of just versus unjust action and government. And nature is deeply related to the problem of the search for human happiness. I think we can call it a problem because, as we know, the search for human happiness is complicated. So I'm going to transition now to St. Thomas and one of the most famous articles on the moral teaching of Aquinas in the Summa. This is from the Prima Secundae, or the first part of the second part of the famous Summa Theologiae, where Aquinas is talking about the foundations of natural law. And he asks questions in this section about whether the natural law can be eradicated in us. So Aquinas has read a lot of Augustine, and he has a rather sober view of human nature. And he knows that human beings can do a great deal of damage to themselves in their own moral conscience, and that whole civilizations can lose track of fundamental precepts of the natural law in major ways. So, in a certain way, the diagnostic question is just how bad can it get? Or how much will be left if you strip away everything that could go? And Aquinas has some rather plausible views about what most fundamental principles of human agency remain no matter what in every civilization. And although I haven't given it to you here, the first place he starts is every human action is in some way motivated by the desire for happiness. Fundamentally, we choose the good and we reject what we consider to be evil, and we coordinate all our activities rationally, deliberatively, in view of seeking to be happy. The good is what we perceive or think objectively, whether rightly or wrongly, will maximize true, authentic happiness and human flourishing, and the evil is that which will not. So it's a kind of practical definition of good and evil as that which facilitate human happiness or harm it. And then he goes on to say, there's some basic inclinations towards happiness in us that are ineradicable. And this sounds a lot like what Jefferson is getting at. The idea that human beings' actions are motivated by the deep inclinations we have toward happiness and that tend to aim towards stable goods, goods that every human civilization must provide or protect if that civilization is to remain human. So I've given you here 3 paragraphs. It's a long article of the Summa, but I took out some of the core substance of it, and I've given it to you here so we can talk about it. It's very basic. I mean, he's looking for something basic. That's the point. If you read this and you think he's going to give us the most elevated, lofty vision of natural law, that's the wrong idea. He's trying to tell us the most fundamental things we will always find. He says the order of the precepts of the natural law is according to the order of natural inclinations. And he goes now to the most fundamental inclination in the human being. He says, because in man there is first of all an inclination to good in accordance with the nature he has in common with all substances, inasmuch as every substance seeks the preservation of its own being according to its nature, and by reason of this inclination, whatever is a means to preserving human life and of warding off its obstacles belongs to the natural law. It's very basic. People like to be. They like to not have their hand held to the stove when it's turned on. They don't like sharp objects poked into their body. They dislike having the flu, and they tend to aim to live, and they tend to aim to avoid death. It's very minimalistic, but it holds fast to empirical experience. Now, Aquinas has a notion very like what we call the notion, well, you know, when you talk about rights, it's a very contested word in our own world today. But Aquinas has a concept which is the kind of medieval foundation of the notion of rights talk, which is the notion of the jus, J-U-S. What is due to a person? He thinks that every human being has certain things due to them based on the kind of nature they have and the inclinations of their nature. So a fundamental use or a fundamental due that we owe each person is to respect their just inclination and capacity to seek to live and to avoid being harmed. Okay, it's just very fundamental. But so under this first category come things like the fundamental inclination to wish for food, clothing, and shelter, and safety and security, freedom from any act of harm. And we could speak then, in Aquinas' way of thinking, about what is due to every human being. And if you like, we could call that a metaphysical or ontological foundation of rights. That every human being has an inclination to want food, security, shelter, freedom from grave harm, and bodily integrity, the preservation of their bodily integrity, and that gives them a just civil right, or what is due to them in the order of justice, that they should be free from those kinds of harms. Now, I haven't, of course, said anything about happiness in this capacity. Just simple freedom from harm is not usually a sufficient condition for happiness. If it were, the life of priests would be so simplified. Our hours would be shorter. You would come to us and we would feed you. We do that. We're big into food, the priesthood, but the priests. But it would just be enough. So we move on to the second category. There are brothers in the Dominican house for whom it's enough, but we're trying to elevate. We're trying to elevate. Secondly, there is in man an inclination to things that pertain to him more specifically according to that nature he has in common with other animals. And in virtue of this inclination, those things are said to belong to the natural law, which nature has taught to all animals, such as sexual intercourse, education of offspring, and so forth. Now, this is a remarkable passage. You would think that Aquinas, of all people, would have a very elevated, quasi-angelic view of the human family and would start from the spiritual motives of human beings, building families up as hearths of friendship and mutual virtue and shared love. No, he says, look, we're animals, and animals tend to couple and have children, have offspring, and they tend to nurture their offspring. Now, the way he's presuming that we can sort of have read some more of the Summa, and he knows that we also know that the human animal is going to do this in a rational way. Right? So when you nurture your offspring as a human being, you have to teach them the alphabet and the affability and some obedience, and eventually things that are dreadful and torturous like math. But the point is that what he's saying is the human beings that are animals will tend to create these kinds of features of any human civilization. Where you find human beings in any civilization, you will find them coupling and having children and caring about their children and nurturing them. And there's a whole sort of sociological development that gives rise to. So this is part of the natural law too. And we could speak, if we want to develop this, about the use, or what is due to every human being, which is the right to freely engage in marriage and the education of their children. In a certain way, Aquinas thinks that's grounded in your animality. That because you are an animal, you have the right to engage in having children through marriage and loving and educating the children you have through marriage. Because it's a very intrinsically human animal thing to do. Now, there's, of course, distinctively human or inhumane ways of acting towards one's spouse and children. So it's not that he's minimalizing, but he is saying that this feature of human civilization is in a certain way ineradicable. You won't really find a world in which this ceases to happen. I know people will bring up the Shakers, but it didn't work. And then he goes to the more specifically human spiritual features. He says, thirdly, there is in man an inclination to good according to the nature of his reason, which nature is proper to him among the animals. And thus man has a natural inclination to know the truth about God. That is amazing. That's the first thing he takes. You have the human reason, so he goes to the summit of what's best in the human animal, which is that you're capable of knowing God, the highest dignity of the human mind. And to live in society, he's thinking about living in society through rational freedom, where you share the truth with other people, where you live in virtuous spiritual friendship with other people. And in this respect, whatever pertains to this inclination belongs to the natural law, for instance, to shun ignorance, to avoid offending those among whom one has to live. That's a very Dominican way of putting it. And other such things regarding the above inclinations. Okay, so that's things like, he's actually saying, now, don't go too quickly into the question of civic rights, because as good Americans, you're going to think, well, there's not a civic right here, Father. But he's thinking about things like you have the natural right not to be lied to. Okay? He's saying you have the natural obligation to communicate the truth. You don't have to communicate every truth, but it's natural to use the capacity to speak and communicate only to try to seek the truth and communicate the truth, to live in the truth with other people, to live in virtuous friendship with other people. He's referencing here the virtue of affability. That's basically trying to live without offending people. That's to treat people with kindness. Aquinas thinks affability is a dimension of justice, because every human being has a fundamental human dignity, nobility, and beauty to them. They are deserving of being treated with affability. He says it's less than friendship, but it's the greatest disposition to friendship. If you treat your coworkers with not just justice of the most rudimentary kind, but with genuine personal affability, you dispose yourself to friendship with them. So he's thinking about these kinds of things, the virtues of affability, justice, life, and community. And so we could talk here about the right to seek the truth, the right to seek the truth, the right to be justly included in society. I'm going to try to flesh that out a little bit more, because that's obviously a very complex notion. I mean, to what extent what do you mean by inclusion? Okay, but the point is that there's a certain kind of human right to be treated as a subject of dignity in some very basic way. And the right to freedom of religion, the right to pursue knowledge of God. Now I'm going to transition, and I'm going to talk about happiness. And I want to transition by creating a problem, or by just identifying a problem. And the problem is this: the things I just named for you, which are this laundry list of kind of basic natural rights as Thomas Aquinas understands them, at least as I'm interpreting him, and saying you could line him up rather nicely with the Declaration of Independence. That list of rights is not really going to procure profound human happiness per se. Okay, so food, clothing, security, the right to freely engage in marriage, and the education of children. We could add the right to private property, because families need private property for the right upbringing of their children. The right to seek the truth, the right to some kind of affable engagement with your fellow members of society, the right to freedom of religion. Well, I mean, most people have something like that in our immediate environment. That doesn't mean everyone's happy. It's amazing, actually, that the Bill of Rights sort of almost suggests that the state would be responsible for your happiness. As I was thinking about preparing this talk, Kafka-esque dreams of surreal short stories in which it would take place in Prussia in the 19th century, and some woman who has studied a fair amount of the French revolutionary literature comes and deposes her complaint before the public tribunal that the state has not provided her with adequate happiness. And she's suing them for, I want my happiness. After the revolution, you owe it to me. And I mean, you could just see Kafka getting into the absurdity of the human being. Well, anyway, the point, maybe it's more a Woody Allen movie, but the point is, the pretense to happiness doesn't devolve immediately from the reclamation of rights. We can give you lots of rights, maybe even real ones, and it won't necessarily make you feel better because you still have the natural problem of human happiness. Now, when Aquinas turns to those human happiness, he does build it out of those natural inclinations. We have these natural inclinations to, say, life in society with others, the search for the truth, knowledge of God. Okay, how is that then going to flesh itself out in an account of happiness? The problem is there are many things we need to be happy, and many of them are not sufficient. They're not fully adequate to procure our happiness. So, I mean, he has the, I'm changing now to the early part of the same section of the Summa, question 2, when he says, he asks the question, what is it that makes human beings happy? I mean, this is the audacity of Aquinas. He really actually plans to answer this question. And if you read Prima Secundae question 2, he just goes through methodically. He actually starts with wealth. The first 5 articles, he lists problematic candidates. And by problematic candidates, I don't mean that these things aren't in some way partial to procuring our happiness, partial answers, but they're not adequate answers. You might say there are conditions sine qua non in some cases, not in all. They're not sufficient conditions in any case. So he begins with artificial and natural wealth. He says artificial wealth is things like money, because it's an artifact that allows you to acquire natural goods. Natural goods are actual, possessions, physical things, external things. Now, following Aristotle, Aquinas thinks a fair amount of natural wealth is necessary for your physical well-being. So it comes under that first inclination to security, food, and shelter, and for the conditions of a life in society, for example, the life of a family. We can talk about whether a person's wage is adequate to support their family, for example. And that's an entirely reasonable question of a minimal amount of natural and artificial wealth. But the point is, this is a problematic candidate for absolute happiness because wealth, although it has an allure to it, is fundamentally a means to permitting life in community. And so it can alleviate a lot of stresses, or it can create sufficient conditions for a happy life together with others, but it isn't really what procures the life of the soul, the flourishing of the soul in life with others. So then he moves on to honor, fame, or glory. Well, part of the problem with honor, as with fame and glory, is they depend upon others. By the way, this is so interestingly borne out by Instagram. Aquinas, if you I don't know who some of these people are, but I get junk mail, and it tells me about famous people they want me to see new pictures of them on Instagram. And you might think, well, that's because they're spiritually vacant people and they just have nothing to do but live lives out in some western state of the country that will remain unnamed for reasons of because my staff from California. But anyway, but that basically there's something kind of spiritually vacant about this. And you could say that, but there's actually something very spiritually ambitious. The problem about being famous, well, because you're beautiful or because you've been in films or whatnot, is there's a lot of upkeep. And that's why there have to be a lot of postings. That's what Twitter is great for people who need to keep up. Honor is about creating and sustaining relations. Relations, Aristotle says, are the most fragile of beings. Your substance continues, your relations are always changing. I mean, I'm related to all of you spatially, like for about another 20 minutes, and then it's going to all dissolve. The relations are fragile. They're inherently fragile ontologically. So if you maintain your happiness through attachments to honor and fame, you need to always be cyclically maintaining and renewing relations. And that means you have to do a great deal of work, and it is ultimately all ephemeral, and it will all fall apart. There's ways to use that towards other things, I suppose, in the interim. Like you could go back to wealth. But yeah, the point is, some of those people need to read the first 3 articles of Summa. Okay, anyway, then he names power. Power is a better candidate, because with power you can actually affect the world. But the problem with power is it's fundamentally a means of getting things done. So those who have power will do well to use it rightly to coordinate their own and other people's lives in view of the attainment of happiness. But simple exercise of power is not really a sufficient condition for happiness. Now, we all know there are people, some of them, famous figures in history, who thought power was an end in itself, or who really got drunk off the lust for power. All these things have an allure to them, and you can basically try to build them up as absolute candidates for happiness. But St. Thomas is trying to argue, and I'm just cursely going over them, he's trying to argue this is not wise. Bodily goods, well, he says, we need a certain amount of bodily goods, but they don't quench the deeper desires of the spirit. And we do have deeper desires of the spirit. Now, you do have the person who sort of convinces themselves I don't know, they go to an analytic philosophy department and they major in philosophy and they become a materialist and they decide that basically if they can just make themselves happy materially, it's going to take care of everything in their psychology. And, they usually try something, whether more hedonist or Epicurean. And if you're a priest, you meet them on the other end of that little exercise and it hasn't worked out. And Aquinas explains that why. He says, all of these things are finite. They accord some kind of finite happiness that may be reasonable and good. I mean, I like filet mignon as much as the next person, but the thing is that the human intellect has a certain thirst for the infinite and even for the infinite good. And so there's always going to be a kind of a spiritual lassitude or incompleteness by just attempting to anesthetize the mind through the life of the senses. And he goes on to talk about this in terms of pleasures. Pleasures are too finite and transitory to provide profound rest. They can, as it were, daze the mind with. They can maybe bathe the senses in intense experiences for a time, but it doesn't really procure long-lasting happiness. We all know or have been the undergraduate who just tries this experience on Friday and Saturday nights, and finds that the homework and the duties of life are still there on Saturday afternoon, and in fact, the existential disquiet. So, anyway, then we get the authentic candidates, and Aquinas doesn't list them all in one place, but he does basically say it's goods of the soul. You do need a lot of these other things. You do need a certain amount of security and natural goods and wealth, but fundamentally, the candidates are the goods of the soul. And he doesn't list them all in this same article, but if you hunt around, you find lists, basically, different places. Friendship, spiritual friendship is, for Aquinas, when you will the good of the other person, and when he or she wills your good, when you both know it, and when you choose to live it through some kind of collective activities. Okay, so it's not sufficient to say, well, we both like to rob banks together, and we're both good at it. I admire your bank robbery skills. I admire yours. You're very useful to me. You're very useful to me. That's fine, but that's not spiritual friendship. That's utilitarian friendship. So spiritual friendship where you delight in the company and affection of the other person and will their good. Life in community then expands from that basic notion through the life of the family and the broader ties of society, often animated by work and artistic creativity. Human beings have a natural practical intellectuality. They like doing things that are artistic and work-related, that they generates meaning for them. It's limited but deep meaning. The pursuit of the knowledge of the truth, religious happiness through the worship and knowledge of God, and finally, Aquinas will give the supernatural answers that he thinks are most ultimate, which are the life of grace and the contemplation of God. And he thinks there's a kind of openness in the soul where it can never find full rest, except ultimately to find rest in the grace of Christ. Now I'm transitioning towards the end. The airplane is approaching the runway. Do not despair. You will soon be allowed to disembark and ask questions and escape back to the Burgundy. But here's the fundamental transition point of the talk, and it really is in a way where I want to not challenge, because that's not the point. I don't want to challenge the Jeffersonian paragraph, but put an important asterisk. And the important asterisk is to note that most forms of deep happiness come from goods possessed in common. Now, by goods possessed in common, I don't mean the timeshare that we have with our uncle in the Keys, although actually that could be a means towards happiness. I mean, it might be better to give the example of when I like my uncle and his family. This is fictional. I like my uncle and his family, and my family and his family enjoy vacationing together in the Keys, and we've had some incredible family vacations that are just refreshment for the soul. That's what I'm talking about. The shared life together. It's the common goods that typically are the place where we find our deepest happiness. It's the common goods that are typically the place where we find our deepest happiness. So we tend to think in modern political philosophy, not always, but if you read someone like Hobbes's Leviathan or some other contemporary theorists, in terms of the state and the individual as the kind of binary units of thinking about political rights and political happiness. There is the state, and there's every individual. The individual is a subject of rights. The individual is subject in some way to the state. The state needs to provide for the individual, and there's also a whole set of relationships that ensue. It's not that it's fundamentally false, but it just leads out all the middle terms of these collective goods, the collective good of family life. There's certain forms of happiness you can't have except if you have together with other people. You can't. Like it's like the theory, the sort of prodigal son image. You can't look at your spouse one day and your children and say, "Honey, children, life with you is so much. It's so happy. There's so much joy here, and I'm enjoying it so much. Like this collective friendship. I'm just going to take my slice of the pie and leave and enjoy it on my own." Because the problem is then the common good that's held together by those sets of relationships of common activities is eviscerated. Okay? So you simply, to sustain the common life of happiness, you have to share in the common project. This, for Catholic religious, it's not your typical example, but for us it's the liturgy. It's, try doing Gregorian chant with 2 people or 3 people compared with 30 people. It's a big difference. When the choir is really, nimbly singing beautifully, and you're able to pray the Psalms or celebrate the Mass in a large collective environment, you have a very different result than if everybody goes to their room and chants on their own. Right? It would be disaster. So, I mean, there are forms of religious life that do permit that you pray basically always on your own, but that you lose the collective good. Okay, so I'm just going to give examples. Now, Aquinas talks, and I'm finishing, but Aquinas talks about 3 kinds of justice. One is the kind that comes intuitively to almost anyone when you ask about justice, and that's called commutative. And that's basically usually a relationship of equality of a shared good. So if I go into the store and I want to purchase, I don't know, I'm not used to this, a can of some cans of tuna fish because I have to cook, and that's how I cook. So the poor brothers. And I've got like 20 cans of tuna fish, right? And then I'm charged $1,000 for 20 cans of tuna fish. Well, there's something that's against commutative justice. There should be some kind of equal measure of pay to what the good is worth. So basically, usually commutative justice has its primary analog or its kind of typical example in economic purchasing, against economic exploitation. Or, you do a day's work, and how much do you get paid? Or someone does a day's work for you, and how much do you pay them? Commutative justice. Distributive justice is the more typical kind of philosopher's interest in our own day and age, which is, what do you owe the common good, and what does the common good owe you? And it's the part to the whole. So if you think about like the question of a special needs child, you have a child born with important disabilities, okay? Does the state, for that matter, does the family, does the community have particular obligations of justice to that child that a less vulnerable child would not receive? Absolutely. So that child should be distributed distinct kinds of goods. Or you have a person who has particular talents, and so you go back to my example, musical person. You have a musical person in your community, if you're in a religious community. Is it reasonable to ask them to distribute injustice as part of their contribution to the common life to produce beautiful music for the community? It could be within reason. Okay, so there's distributive justice is sort of the messy, unequal forms of collaborative justice. But then there's another kind of justice that Aquinas mentions that's actually fundamentally typical for him, which he calls legal, sometimes called social justice. When you hear social justice, if you're from a modern Catholic context, you're typically thinking actually about distributive justice. You're thinking, well, social justice is the state needs to provide mechanisms for the security and care of those who are most underprivileged, etc. That's actually distributive justice, if you use the term correctly. Social justice is the rights and responsibilities of the persons who accede to life in a group. it's particularly that kind of collective happiness I'm talking about. Like, so for example, if you're part of a family, I'm talking about like a domestic family, you have certain rights and certain obligations to inclusion in that family and to commitment to that family, precisely to sustain the joy and happiness of collective life with those persons. Now, these can be very facile obligations, easy, because they give you the greatest happiness. Like the obligation to attend regular prayers throughout the day, if you're Dominican, or if you work in a place that you like working, okay, and you have a happy community with the people you work with, then you have a kind of happy obligation to treat them humanely and to live with them in friendship and to enjoy working, to contribute in such ways to enjoy working with them, okay? So this kind of justice of living, of inclusion in projects of common good, projects of common goods and of being good in common, of enjoying the happiness of living in community of various kind. So where I want to conclude is this. If you follow Aquinas' understanding of the inclination to happiness and you look at where he's identifying it, friendship, life in community, artistic creativity, pursuit of the knowledge of the truth, religious happiness, we don't do this stuff alone. We do this in common life with others of various kinds. We're here tonight to kind of talk about the truth, probably to fraternize a fair amount. And it's an attempt to delight in the company of others in the pursuit of the truth. It's a collective act, okay? So those basic inclinations in us need to be respected by and in a certain way preserved and helped by the state or by the local government or by the local authority of, say, a domestic family in its government to provide those, allow those inclinations to flourish. And here's the key thing. If you have a uniquely individualistic conception of happiness, you cannot understand adequately the obligations of the state to respect the nature of the common good and the common goods in the plural that make people happy. So you could think about the median, I'm talking about like middle common goods that any state needs to respect. The life of the family, the life of the church, in fact, in some way, the life of the corporation or the small business with its, the life of the arts, the political think tank. It's a kind of way of sharing in the search for the truth and promoting it. The university. You can complain about particular universities, their configurations and the internal culture, but the idea of a place, a common life where people pursue the truth together, that's a fundamentally sound, beautiful, and good, common good that needs to be preserved, facilitated, and sustained, at least respected by the state. So I'm just going to finish with this last comment on your sheet. Natural rights of institutions and common goods don't per se come from the state, nor are they facilitated by the market. Now, I'm making a comment here against a kind of mega collectivity of the left and maybe a minimalist individualism of a libertarian sort. You can't just follow Adam Smith's laws and expect necessarily that those common goods will arise. Well, actually, they may well arise, but the market forces per se need not respect them. That doesn't mean I'm not arguing for any special protections for them. I'm simply saying, I'm just trying to say it's not like just individualism and market forces generate per se the common goods. Nor is it the case that the state can generate them. On the contrary, they're natural and they are presupposed. They're prior to both the state and the market, and they have to be in some way the goods we aim to facilitate our own happiness in life, in community with others, in the midst of the life of the state and the market. They precede both, and they have to be acknowledged by both. So I think respecting and preserving people's natural inclinations, and therefore you might call what is due to them or their natural rights, is deeply related to respecting their collective forms of happiness that they seek to live together in particularly typically human ways. Now, thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor for questions. Yes, sir. You were first. Oh. So we have a question up here. No, it's right here.
So thank you very much for the excellent lecture. I wanted to ask a question about that one of those first clauses in the Declaration of Independence dealing with the self-evident nature of natural rights. And I thought it was very interesting, your connection in your speech of the rights of property to the rights of families to possess the things necessary for the rearing of children. And I wanted to ask if there was any other context that would be in itself self-evident, provable by its own nature, that could explain the origin of property rights.
Okay, that's a wonderful question. So I think everyone heard it, but it's about the idea that property rights are self-evident in the Declaration of Independence. Now, I'm going to be you go to the casino and you find that there are people gambling there, and you shouldn't be scandalized. So if you talk to Dominicans, you might find they sometimes prefer Aquinas' views to others. Aquinas actually asks this question: is it self-evident that people's private property ought to be respected? And he talks about first order, second order, and third order precepts of the natural law. And he says only the first order precepts are self-evident. And he thinks among those are the basic inclinations that we should seek to do the good as best we understand it, avoid evil, and seek happiness, and that these basic inclinations are inscribed in us. The inclination to try to survive, the inclination to life in the family, and the inclination to the truth, to try to find the truth and to live in some way in society. And that you can't really get away from that. You can take your most despotic, dysfunctional example of human government in history, and you'll still find something like those self-evident basic goods, even though it's being selectively maybe taken away from some people, is being preserved for others. That's not to justify it. I'm just trying to say there's a way in which it can't be eviscerated even in the most acutely immoral forms of government. Then he says there's second order precepts, and he there alludes to the Ten Commandments, and among them he puts the positive precept that correlates to the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal. Am I getting it right? The seventh? Or is it the eighth? Yeah. Thou shalt not steal. The positive correlation is that there needs to be a just respect of the private property of others. And he says, funnily enough, talking about this, he says, but at certain times and places, this understanding of this second order precept has not been self-evident to people, and there have been whole governments or tribes that have stolen and taken the property of others in unjust ways. So Aquinas thinks, he uses the language of self-evident to mean that it really could not fail to be seen. But as we know from, say, for example, the 20th century with communism, it can fail to be seen by some people. Now, he does think that second order precept follows pretty carefully from the first order precept. So he thinks most reasonable people will come to see it, he says, fairly intuitively, and if they're taught it will confirm their reason very usually with fairly happily. But he wants to be able to explain how it can be eviscerated. Now, this came up in the 19th century, particularly in Pope Leo XIII's disputes with communism and socialism. And in, I think it's 1891, Pope Leo XIII published an incredibly important papal encyclical that was of historic import for all of modern Europe, which is called Rerum Novarum, new things, basically. And it's an engagement with the argument of communism and socialism that modern civic society and the church have not done enough to facilitate the amelioration of life conditions of people in the Industrial Revolution, and that the best way to procure the happiness of the working class is to dissolve private property and have redistribution occur by the means of the state. I mean, you're getting the rise of the socialist communist movement. And he is extremely tenacious in arguing for the necessity of the right of private property for the maintaining of the dignity and integrity of the individual. And he says it's even more incumbent for the family. So it's very interesting that Leo XIII argues that although each individual may have a right to private property, which he says it's there, it's necessary for any individual's autonomy. When you begin to see these, what I'm calling these median common goods, and he thinks the family is the most basic common good because it provides life for society and the fundamental sort of matrix of education and love of children, then you have an even more incumbent strengthening of the natural right to private property. In other words, he thinks like the family has more right to private property than the individual, even though they both have the right. That's not a very typical contemporary way of thinking, but it makes a lot of sense. You know, to say that the higher the stakes, the more the rights are acute.
Father, thank you very much. I intern on Capitol Hill, and I asked a very senior member of leadership on the House side a question about their faith and poverty. My question to you is where does the line go between the church, government, and what Aquinas says and what you've talked about, on where the church and government should go towards combating poverty, and where you think the common individual should have a role in that? I've been thinking about this, and this is something that I know the House leadership, along with members of the administration, are thinking about. So this is a question that I've had, and if you could answer it, that'd be great. Thank you.
It sounds like a dodge to say that my expertise is not in modern Catholic social justice theory, but really all I want to say is that what I'm about to say is the imperfect conjectural musings of someone who specializes in systematic theology and not moral theology, okay? But a couple of thoughts here. First of all, the line is always moving about what is possible in light of more than just technological development or medical development, but also the particular configurations of society at any one time. So a lot of the argument about what can or ought to be done is based on complex circumstances in which intelligent people can disagree about priorities. So, I mean, you could take the question of emergent medical technologies and the treatment of a rampant virus. Okay, so take a rampant virus you're trying to treat, but then add in this complexity. On the one hand, we have the technology and we can mass produce it. On the other hand, it's become prohibitively expensive to mass produce it without also neglecting what we produce with regards to some other medical remedy. Okay, so now we're into an extremely complex proportional calculus. And there are going to be intelligent people. Now, just to expand that, to go from the sector of the economy, the piece of pie that goes to health care for people, for the indigent, versus trying to help the indigent who have drug addictions, trying to talk about job creation programs, and how do you cut up those pieces of the pie? And so I'm just trying to say there's always going to be some very great difficulties about practical applications. The church, since the 19th century, has developed this body of modern social justice doctrine, in part to look at these complex cases in real time. She has tended to insist on a number of, you might call them ideal goals. I mean, usually she uses the language of rights. I think it's often more helpful to talk about ideal goals. But basically, the right and responsibility of every adult capable person of working. So, you know, normally an adult person has a responsibility to contribute to the larger society by working, but we could talk about it as also a capacity or a right that the state should seek to facilitate. So the state should seek to have the goal of job growth. That's a fairly, I think, modest claim. The church has insisted on the right of education. Now that's very tricky. There is a right to education. Education is often how you fight indigency and scolarize people, get them involved in the job market. But then how high is the bar, and how wide do you want to go, and how international do you want your aims to be? Because a lot of problems of international poverty are also about lack of education. The church has always been very engaged in providing for the common good in terms of health care, hospitals, education, and food, clothing, and shelter, as well as spiritual care. Obviously, that's something that our modern governments typically don't look at all, about the sort of spiritual religious care of persons. I think with regards to, say, for example, I think that the church is going to tend to think that it is in a modern nation state of the European or American sort, where you have adequate health care in principle to allow each human being access to medical care, you need some kind of system that facilitates access. That doesn't necessarily mean the government has to provide it or ought to, although there are people who argue that, and I have a lot of problems with some of what I consider the anti-religious elements of Obamacare. And maybe I have some ambivalence about the way Obamacare has been done, as well as its questions of fiscal responsibility. But if you take a much simpler case, if you have someone who is found gravely ill, who comes into an emergency room, and they don't have insurance, and the hospital refuses to serve them, even though and then they die, I think that the Catholic Church would say that that's an act of grave injustice to the person. Now, how do you build out from that a larger case about trying to have proportionate access to good forms of health? I think a lot of these things then come down to deep prudential disagreements. One example is the just wage. Leo XIII emphasized in the face of the modern industrial revolution that children should not be forced to work 16 hours a day, that they needed to be educated, that men who are in their full health could be asked to work longer hours than women who are typically having children, and that there had to be what he called a living wage, so that if you had typically you had one person in the family working, that person should not be exploited, but should be paid enough that they could support their wife and children. A lot of our notions now of minimum wage are the results of those kinds of impetuses to keep people from being manipulated in desperate circumstances in industrial Europe in the 19th century. So now you take a question like raising minimum wage today. I was asked to do something on this on EWTN, and I went and read the catechism. It's very interesting. There's two principles there. There's the universal obligation of the state, to try to create work for everyone, and there's the obligation of the state to try to facilitate a just living wage for everyone. Now, the two principles can act almost mathematically directly against one another. You could raise the minimum wage to $25 an hour, and you would create massive unemployment. You can lower it, and you can create more employment. And so, you've got one party that's going to talk about a lower minimum wage to try to have a healthy, life of small businesses and wider employment. You've got another party that's going to talk about trying to increase the minimum wage. They're not, in terms of Leo XIII's teaching, they're both right. But intelligent people are going to disagree about which economic proposals are realist to try to help the most people maximally. So you see, I avoided ever taking a party line.
Thank you very much. I didn't know you.
Okay, we know you got the microphone.
Hear me?
John,
I talked first. So, my question about in the articles you were referencing on natural law, when Aquinas addresses how the natural law, whether it can be eliminated from the human heart, in what ways the natural law becomes obscured or sedimented. Can you perhaps speak to the ways in which that can happen and how that can impact rights talk, as we're both fairly far removed from the Thomistic understanding of rights, even though you might not have called them that, and happiness, and the Jeffersonian, and how our understanding of the pursuit of happiness today has perhaps obscured our habits of pursuit, have obscured the natural law.
Yeah. Well, the problem is, in some ways you do have new situations in which you do need to talk about rights and responsibilities in new ways and new contexts, but you also have, let's say, the cultural creation of rights that could be very contestable. Take a case that no one here will be surprised that I would bring up, which is the right to human life from conception to natural death. And other people think that there's a natural right to, or a human right, social right, legal right to abortion, okay? So there you've got two conceptions of rights talk that are inimical to one another, mutually incompatible fundamentally. or yeah, I think fundamentally incompatible, and that are both aiming at one and the same subject of nature, the pregnant woman, right? So you have deep discord about what we mean by rights. In a way, I think what you're alluding to by the question is, to what extent can moral blindness set into a culture to such an extent that we not only fail to see what true natural rights are, but we create or generate the language of human rights in ways that obscures the reality of nature. All right, so actually the language of natural rights is now becoming an obstacle to the right perception of natural rights. Rights talk against real natural rights. And I do think that if you're, for example, convicted about the fact that the individual human life begins at conception and has an inherent natural dignity that should not be violated, then you have to conclude that that's what's happening. And so on the other hand, I would just say part of the answer is to try to go back and look at what a human being is. And I do agree with John Paul II in the encyclical Fides et Ratio that the fundamental crisis behind moral confusion in our own age is a crisis of the truth. The human being is capable of the truth, and the human being is capable of grave confusion about the truth. And so I think just simply following our own intuitions and instincts is never enough. We do need to go back and try to examine what we think the structure of reality is. And I do think Aquinas is an important guide for helping us to track onto reality intellectually and get back in touch with natural rights. Yes, sir.
The natural urge to procreative sexual intercourse and the education of offspring. Could you flesh out for us how that leads to the family and not some sort of Brave New World situation? Because I think, we all have friends who get what Aquinas says on the paper here, but not what we think.
Right. So, the intrinsic connection between human coupling and sexual intercourse and having children, and then committing to raise those children in a committed family context, and that's profoundly compromised in our own time. The perception of that. We just come back to this. Actually, I was just going for something rather minimal here, which was to say that there will always be many people in civilization who tend to eventually choose to have children and to raise them or seek to raise them as couples. So it's a very modest statement. Now, when I was talking to the first question about self-evident truths, another example Aquinas gives of a second order precept that can be effaced from the human mind is the thou shalt not commit adultery. The positive precept was human sexuality is in some way fundamentally oriented toward the loving commitment to another, first of all, procreation, and the loving commitment to another person in a procreative relationship open to life where you have children and raise them. Now, actually, as a priest, strangely, I'm optimistic about this in common culture because I see it triumph over all the ideologies in the end. They often, after a long time and with a lot of confusion and some errors along the way, but it tends to be the case that people actually do settle on this conception, or at least they aspire to it. Not in every case. There are people who live very consistently ideologically opposed lives to that principle for long duration, but it's rare. And sometimes they capitulate with agony to the fact that they've had a mistaken conception. So when he says, why are the second order precepts often eviscerated or obscured for us, he gives different reasons. So he says, sometimes it's the vehemence of the passions, and sometimes it's ideology. It's my more modern word, but basically speculative errors of reason. So if you've got so first of all, Aquinas is an Augustinian, so he thinks the vehement passions of human sexual attraction often confound human reason. This is true. And so when you have that bit, and then you've got the technological production of forms of contraception that allow people to not live committed marital relationships for long periods of time, which were generated in part because of the vehemence of the sexual appetite And then you have the ideological belief that it's okay to, you referred to Brave New World, it's okay to radically reconfigure couplings, both on one side of the menu, the way people couple sexually, and on the other side of the menu, the way they choose to reproduce. Then you can have a lot more kind of deep confusion, at least for Aquinas' view of these things, that settles in. But it is hard to eradicate the deep natural inclination of people to want to have children with someone they love and to raise those children with someone they love. And it does tend to persevere in them as a deep norm. So I think, as Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says, if you're in the marriage business, it's a good time to invest because people are always going to want the product.
Thank you, Father Thomas Joseph, for that wonderful talk. I'm Paul Ray. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the president of the DC chapter of the Thomistic Institute. And you've been here for the final lecture in our... Can you hear me? Is that better? Thank you, Beatrice. You've been here for the final lecture in our series on politics and the philosophy of St. Thomas. So a big thank you also to Matt Spalding and to the Kirby Center for hosting the series. Now, as you know, if you've been here, the Thomistic Institute exists to promote Catholic truth in our contemporary world by strengthening the intellectual formation of Christians at universities, in the church, and in the wider public square. The thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, the universal doctor of the church, is our touchstone, as you may have gathered. The Thomistic Institute is part of the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception at the Dominican House of Studies here in Washington, and if you don't know anything about that, ask any of the men in white. Next month, we are shifting gears and hosting a talk by Father Thomas Joseph entitled, Can Beauty Save the World? Aquinas on Art and Liturgy. I don't want to presume what Father's answer will be, but I think it might be yes. And I heard him give the minister version of his lecture a few months ago, and it was extraordinary, so I encourage everyone to go. The lecture will be at St. Charles Borromeo Church in Arlington on April 26 at 7 p.m. So without further ado, we'd like to invite you all to adjourn in just a moment, but I believe Matt Spalding has a word to say.
Thank you. I also just wanted to, in addition to allowing the great pitch for the Thomistic Institute, and happy to host all of you here again in the future, thank the Thomistic Institute and Father Dominic for these wonderful talks. And since we don't have another Thomistic Institute talk to bring to your attention, I will invite you all to join us next Tuesday evening when Michael Walsh, great social critic, is speaking on his book here entitled The Devil's Pleasure Palace, The Cult of Critical Theory and the Subversion of the West. And that'll be a wonderful event that I bring you to attention. I hope you join us for future Kirby events here as well. And just in closing, since that's what we do, I would draw your attention to additional proof of this wonderful talk to George Washington's first inaugural address, where he makes it very clear that by happiness, he points out that there is no truth more thoroughly established in the economy and course of nature, that there is a connection between virtue and happiness. That's his first inaugural address to the first president. So with that, I thank you again, and please join us for the reception.